Well, we'll get started. Thank you for your patience and thank you all for showing up tonight. My name is Tim Brownell. I'm the new director of the Solid. I think we're moving on. Yeah. Why? So much for so much for. Can you hear me okay? Can they hear online with me like this, Sue? Yep. All right. Well, where was I? Yeah. So I'm with the solid waste department. With me here is several people from our consulting firm Parametrics, who has been helping with the solid waste siting process, and Concord Communications, who's helped with our communications to the public in regards to this project. Also here, we have a couple of county commissioners. Phil Chang is here. Tony DeBone, I believe, is still here. We have two former solid waste department directors, Tim Shimke, who many of you may know. He's long-standing, highly respected, lovely man. Thanks for being here, Tim, and for leading the programs and developing them here in Deschutes County for a generation. And Chad Santola, who took on the direction of the solid waste department for about 2.5 years once Tim retired, and Chad just recently retired and generously supported me as I transitioned into the position. He was a godsend. So thank you, Chad. Happy retirement. With that, I just want to kind of lay out quickly what some of the things we're going to touch on tonight. We're going to provide a little bit of background of the solid waste department and the role that it plays, and some of the other future activities that we're looking at in addition to the solid waste landfill siting project. Go through that quickly and then get into the landfill siting piece and answer any questions you have at the end. So hopefully I'll get through this in about 20 minutes or 25 minutes, but I've been known to talk longer, so bring the hook out. So the solid waste department itself is responsible for the collections in the unincorporated parts of the county, of recycling solid waste, as well as operating the transfer sites located around the county, and the not landfill. On the collection side, what we're responsible for are really setting a few things. One is the minimum service levels for the different materials collected. Also setting the rates. The rate structure is approved by the Board of County Commissioners and reviewed by the solid waste staff. So there's a maximum rate that you can be charged, and then we do monitor the two haulers, which are Republic Services and Cascade Disposal, for their profit margin. So we want them to be able to run a business that works for them, but is also in the interest of the community. And then we also manage the hazardous waste collection programs here, both at remote collections at Sisters, Redmond, and La Pine, as well as our permanent facility out at Knott Landfill. In regards to recycling, we have curbside collection. We have the drop-off sites at all the depots, the transfer stations. We have yard debris composting that's done by Republic Services, but on leased property owned by the county. And then the county is also responsible for the promotion and education components of our waste diversion programs. We do that in conjunction with the Environmental Center here in Bend, as well as our collection partners. The transfer system, most of you are probably aware of. We have 4 transfer stations, one outside of Redmond. We refer to it as Negus Transfer Station, the Southwest Transfer Station just north of La Pine, the Northwest Transfer Station near Sisters, just a little bit east of Sisters. And then out in Alfalfa, we have a transfer station that is open 1 day a week on Saturdays. And then obviously the disposal at Knott Landfill, and Tim, you can correct me if I'm wrong. We were looking at Knott Landfill has been open since approximately 1970. Is that correct? 72. All right. They were thinking about it in 1970. That area in the bottom right, which says Area A, that is the original landfill that started in 72. And that by 1993, there were new federal regulations called Subtitle D, which regulated municipal solid waste landfills. And that original facility was what we would refer to as a dump. It was a hole in the ground, and it was a space to be filled up. By 93, regulations came into effect that these had to be managed in a very different way to protect the environment, to protect groundwater, protect surrounding communities, to make sure that vectors, which, you know, birds of prey and other scavengers were controlled. So you'll see that the other outlined areas are what are called cells, and those are developed one at a time. They last 3 to 5 years. They're lined. They have gas management and what's called leachate, the liquid, the soup at the bottom, that all gets managed. So Knott Landfill is now an engineered facility, as we call it, and the next facilities in the future all have to be managed in much the same way. We have to do environmental monitoring there, groundwater monitoring, the one on the top. We have wells that go all the way down to the water tables. That goes down to, I don't know, 670 feet or so is where the water table is below Knott Landfill. There are a series of wells around the sites that we monitor if there's any contamination that is leached all the way down through the soils. To that point, there has been no indication, no hits of anything leaching through, even in that unlined area. Then the next piece is we have to manage the leachate and the gas on the site. Leachate, as I said, is that swill that's down at the bottom. We recirculate that. It's picked up by tubes, a system to evacuate it from the bottom and then redistribute it back into the mass. And it helps. We're in a very dry environment. This allows for kind of controlled decomposition in the landfill. That decomposition process creates landfill gas, and that landfill gas is predominantly methane, but it's all sorts of other things. It's carbon dioxide, it's oxygen, it's nitrogen. But the gas of concern when generated is methane, and it's produced when things are decomposing without oxygen. So we have a system of recovery, and if you've ever driven by Knott Landfill at after dark, you'll see a tower with a blue flame burning, and that's called a flare. and it's a destruction device. It's meant to burn that methane gas to destroy it. It's quite a significant climate impacting gas. So that's the manner in which we're currently managing it, and I'll tell you how we're going to manage it. Pardon me, in the future. And then in 2029, the landfill is expected to be full by the end of 2029. And so then we're going to have to close that facility, and there's a whole process of closure where you basically seal it up so that there's no intrusion of rainwater, vermin, anything. It's you basically put a 2 to 3 feet. Currently on that area A that's closed, we have up to 5 or 6 feet of soils on it, and then you put native grasses and plantings. We're having to start to think about what is the end use of that site. And this was a rendering that was done probably 10 years ago of it being kind of meadows, walking paths, a little dog park in the southeast corner. And we're still kind of looking and conceiving where could we go. One thing we've been talking about recently is could we have a mixed use, like on the right, where it is some walking paths and meadows, and as well as an energy farm. So we could put solar panels on there. It's a landfill when closed it's structurally unstable enough so that you can't build on it. So it really has to have a passive use once it's closed. So we're looking at what are those options, and we're going to have to start developing that and having a public process on it. Originally, we were thinking Bend Parks and Rec would be a great partner on this. They've now bought parkland, big swaths of land, both to the south west and due south of us, well over 600 acres, I think, combined. So there may not be a need for public use. So that's why thinking about an energy use might be an interesting way to go. So in 2019, the solid waste department went through the development of a solid waste management plan about how are we going to, knowing that the landfill was going to be closing in time, knowing that our waste stream was going to be growing definitely over time, and along with the population. So what were we going to have to look at doing with our programs over the next generation, the next 30 years and beyond? And there's a lot of recommendations within that solid waste plan, in addition to citing a new landfill disposal facility, also improving and increasing opportunities to recycle for businesses, for multifamily residents, for expanding compost programs and infrastructure, as well as creating standards of performance and for the recycling programs. And within that was recommendations on facility improvements. And so I'll touch on a few of those in a moment. But to give you a sense of scale, there's 310 in 2021, the last confirmed numbers of our waste stream from the Department of Environmental Quality, 310,000 tons. That's 620 million pounds of garbage or of waste is generated in the county. In 2021, about 29% of that waste was recovered. It was recycled or composted, whether that be the curbside recycling, scrap metal, composting, etc. So that left about 220,000 tons disposed of in the landfill that year. So it's a significant amount of material that we're trying to manage. And then the state has prescribed for this region, for Deschutes County, that we increase our diversion, our recovery to 45% of that waste stream by 2025. I will say we aren't going to hit 45% by 2025. The pandemic really, I would say, kind of interrupted a lot of things, and one of those is the planning and movement forward on diversion. Another thing that occurred is in 2021, the state legislature passed something called the Recycling Modernization Act, which will make programs around the state consistent So if you can recycle something in Portland, you can recycle it in Sisters. There's also going to be, it's what's called extended producer responsibility legislation. So manufacturers of products and packaging are going to have to start to participate. Right now, it's on you as the ratepayer to basically pay the cost for all of our recycling, diversion, and disposal activities. So industry that is putting these products into our communities have to start to contribute to that process, which will bring resources to the county and allow us to build some of this infrastructure that we're going to be looking at putting in place. So one of the things I just want to touch on, some of the projects we're working on now, and what we're looking at working on. So on the left is the not landfill transfer station. Probably most of you have driven into that building at some point. You probably used to drive out to the dump and maybe enjoyed that more. But now you go into a building, it's much safer for the staff and employees, as well as the public. You can see on the right up at the Redmond transfer station, the Negus transfer, that we're building a new building up there to replicate that. Once that's completed and opened by late winter, we'll start looking at doing the same down in La Pine. And that's where we collect the refuse, and then we'll be moving it towards landfill. The other thing we're doing at not landfill, so that flare I was talking about that's burning off the methane, we've recently, within the last 6 months, signed a contract with Cascade Natural Gas to move from, basically the top line is what we're currently doing, capturing that methane gas and flaring it off. That makes us compliant with regulations of the state. What we're going to be doing with Cascade is actually processing that gas, removing any contaminants in it, which would be sulfur and siloxane, and then removing the other gases. Will make it to 97 to 98% pure natural gas, which can then be put into through a substation into the natural gas pipeline serving Bend. So there's a substation right around the corner from not landfill that will directly be distributing natural gas from the landfill into our communities, to our stoves, our hot water heaters, et cetera. Then a couple other things we're looking at. This is not landfill site. That red building is right just to the east of what is currently the transfer station that you drive into. We're looking at the possibility of building a large building, what we would call a material recovery building, or a MRF. You'll hear that. That's a great acronym. Love that one. And in it, we would put processing equipment for the processing of recyclable material, the commingled recycling that's collected at the curb here, as well as something for processing construction and demolition debris for the recovery of scrap metals, clean wood waste, bulky plastics, sheetrock, a slew of other materials. 30% of the waste stream here in Deschutes County is construction related debris. And all of that is currently being landfilled. So we're looking at building that type of infrastructure. And then the last thing is expanding our composting capacity. We're currently only able to process or compost about half of all the vegetative waste that's collected within the county. With the fire-free programs, fire-wise programs, the amount of woody debris that's collected in this county is more than we're able to process at the current site at not landfill. That's about an 8-acre site. To be able to process and cure and then have enough space to hold it and sell it, we probably need closer to 30-40 acres or more. So this is just a schematic of if we were to place a site up at the Negus Redmond site as a possibility. We have quite a bit of county land up there, so that's a thing for us to contemplate. So now the meat of the meeting. The So with the siting process, what we've been working with is a group called the Solid Waste Advisory Committee. And that's composed of 12 folks here within the county. 4 of which are appointed by the cities, the city of Bend, Lapine, Sisters, and Redmond. There's the 2 franchise haulers have representatives on that group. The environmental center is represented on that group, and then 5 community members at large are part of the SWAC. They're helping advise us, helped with the design of the process for selection. They're providing input and guidance. They've been meeting now for just about 18 months. Monthly. So they've been contributing 2 to 3 hours a month for 18 months. They helped with the selection criteria, the criteria by which we evaluate the sites. They recommended that onto the Board of County Commissioners, who gave the final approval of, yes, this is how we will judge and assess sites. And then they'll make a recommendation of the final of the 2 remaining sites, or third if it comes into the process. They'll be the ones making the recommendation to the Board of County Commissioners of the recommended site. The Board of County Commissioners will then be the ones to make the final selection. I spoke a bit about our project team. This is just kind of steps of the process from the solid waste management plan, kind of set the direction of this process, and then moving it all the way down to a final selection. So I wanted to kind of touch on the screening process. So how are we kind of working sites through the final through and to the final selection? So this is a map of the areas that were deemed not viable to site a landfill. They contained fatal flaws. So there were issues of floodplains. They were on fault lines, core sage grouse habitat. What else do we have in here? Oops. Proximity to groundwater.
The city is.
Oh yeah, airports. Proximity to airports, and they had to be outside of city urban growth boundaries. So these were the regions in which were outside of all of the steep slopes. That was another site. So these are the areas in the county that fell outside of those exclusionary zones or exclusionary areas. And then these also were assessed as to were they viable. I'm going to show something very quickly. You can't read it from there. Don't even try. It just gives you a sense of the top 3 colored blocks are land use, site characteristics, and natural environment. Those are the 3 subgroups that we assessed all the properties on. Then they had a whole series of different subtasks underneath it that all had percentages. So we had a scoring system, but it went through well over 50 criteria that any site that was being assessed had to be evaluated on. And so once we did that, we ended up arriving at 31 sites that we would go through broad site screening. You'll see nothing was still down in the Lapine area. Everything was ruled out down there because of how close the groundwater is to the surface. It's within 30 feet in a lot of areas, no more than 100 feet. That is much too close for contemplating siting a landfill. So it wasn't technically a fatal flaw, but there was no support to consider in that area. And so those 33 sites we went assessing their viability. A lot of individual property owners. So when we were looking at properties, let me tell you what we were looking for is a 500-acre site, 250 acres of that for an actual landfill and 250 acres of buffer area around that. So we were looking for parcels in and around 500 acres. There were about 200 sites within the county, but by the time we got out of the exclusionary areas and we got past groundwater proximity amongst and airport issues, we got down to 12 sites. Of those 12 sites, 7 were taken out. 4 were property owners. Private property owners said we're not interested in selling. And then 3 of them were within 5 miles of an airport. So when we originally started looking at sites, the federal law from the EPA is you can't be within 10,000 feet. So about 2 miles from an airport. However, the FAA, their guidelines and recommendations, and they're pretty firm about this, is they don't want you within 5 miles. And the reason for that is bird strikes is the primary reason. So landfills can cause some birds of prey to come around there, particularly in the wintertime when they're moving out of the mountains. So that was an area of concern. So that took 3 sites, one on Rickard Road, one on off of Bear Creek, and we had a site up at the Negus transfer station. All 3 of those were bounced off. So that really left us with 5 sites. When we got down to that number, we started working with Commissioner Chang around the potential of looking at BLM properties. So the Bureau of Land Management obviously has a lot of land in this area. However, they have very little land that is on what they call their disposal list, that they're readily available and looking to get rid of. None of those parcels worked for a landfill, both either location size wise or the configuration of the land. However, they do have a process in which land could be granted to a community, but it's actually an act of Congress. So it's got to be voted on and put in a bill. So to have that done, you need a consensus and full support of the entire legislative body of this area, as well as our state representatives in Congress. So we did start to look at 3 potential BLM properties. It's an expedited process if it does get approved by the Congress and Senate. It can be much faster than the normal 10-year process. It might take a couple of years to get through. So we started to look at a site off of Highway 97. We call it the Highway 97 site. That one is on this list. However, it dropped off when we got more clarity from the Redmond Airport. They've purchased additional land to the south, and you have to measure that 5-mile buffer from their property boundary. That took this site off the list. So we had 5 sites remaining. This is how they scored. The 2 Roth properties scored the highest based on the critical criteria. The Moon Pit site, which is adjacent to the Badlands, scored next best. And then there were 2 pieces of Department of State lands that are owned far out to the east, pretty distant. They also have long-term grazing rights on them. So they scored poorly and ultimately were dropped off the list. We also looked at cost, what it would cost to operate these sites. The Moon Pit site scored the best on this. And then we also looked at residential proximity. So how many people are close to these sites? Moon Pit has one person within 1 mile. Within 2 miles, none within 1 mile. The Roth East site has 2 within 1 mile, 8 within 2 miles. The DSL properties, obviously nobody near them, other than 3 within 2 miles of the north. So the SWAC recommended to winnow it down to 2 sites to go into what's called phase 2 assessment. This will be a deep dive into 2 sites, or a deep assessment into their viability and compatibility with this use. The one on the Badlands, it's a little north and east of, or south and east of the Badlands themselves. That's the Moon Pit site. And then farther out to the east at the towards the base of Pine Mountain is what we refer to as the Roth East site. The Moon Pit site is an active aggregate mine run by the Hooker Creek Company, and the Roth property, it's referred to as that. It's the Roth family owns that property. It's about 1,800 acres. This is just a little closer view of the Moon Pit site. Just up to the left, up and to the left on that site is the Badlands National Monument. So it's just kind of across the street from it, if you want to call the access road a street. And then this is the Roth East site, so that you can see where it is in relation to Highway 20 and Pine Mountain. So with that recommendation of moving forward with those 2 sites, the diagram on the right is just kind of the elements that you have in a landfill. It's got a liner system, a leachate recovery system. It's got a sensor system to determine it's what's a double line system. So you want to make sure that liquid in the bottom, if it gets through one liner, there's still a second liner there to hold it in place, and you get notification. We have sensors that will let us know that there's a leak in that liner. That is something you ideally don't want, but that's why you have a second liner in case, and then you can start to look at what are your remediation plans. In both these places, the depth to groundwater is pretty significant. I think the Moon Pit, it's close to 1,100 feet thereabouts, 1,100 feet down for the aquifer underneath the Roth East site. I believe it's somewhere in the 600 feet. We'll find out more as we go through the process, and but well depths there are pretty deep. We'll be doing geophysical surveying, geotechnical drilling. We'll be doing seismic testing to get a sense of what's the geology there, what's the dirt. We do in any site when you operate a landfill, you need dirt. You need about 20% of what you put into a landfill is actually dirt to cover it at the end of the day. We're operating 10 acres at a time around it. It's not a 250 acre scar in the ground that we're operating on. We're doing about 10 acres at a time. And doing assessment of transportation, how vehicles would get out to these sites, as well as what it would take to get utilities to these sites. The one thing I do want to note is that these are, whatever we put the landfill, it's going to be what we call a limited access site. So it won't be like not landfill where we have 700 vehicles come into that site every day to drop off recyclables or refuse. It will just be the transfer vehicles. So basically semi trucks, about 30 a day, would be leaving our not landfill site or our Negus site, or any one of our transfer stations. Those are the vehicles that would go to the landfill. All of the public users would continue to use our transfer stations, as would most likely the refuse trucks that are collecting on your route. They would probably go to our transfer station, deliver materials there into a semi truck, and then we would haul it out.
If you do that recycling thing that you're proposing, I think not. does that mean all the transfer stuff first goes to that? And then
Yes, so the question was, if we have recycling related facilities at not landfill, would everything run through that? No, not everything. What would run through a recycling facility would be recycling rich materials, like construction demolition material, or recycling specific loads that are collected. It wouldn't be processing all garbage and pulling out recyclables. Good question, thanks. So this is kind of the timeline we're looking at. We're currently in that 22 to 24 range where we're trying to identify the finalist site. We want to make a recommendation in the spring, in April, May timeline to the Board of County Commissioners. And then that starts a whole new process. There's a public process for land use. So this would be open to the public to kind of comment and see if these sites were appropriate use for the land that we're proposing. There's also the state regulation, the permitting process. Department of Environmental Quality regulates the landfill and operation of landfills. So this would have to go to them for a formal permitting process. That's also a very public process, pretty cumbersome. There's also most likely going to be litigation. There are going to be citizens concerned with this use of land, particularly as we're moving into pretty pristine areas within the county. So this next process, once one site is chosen, then we're talking another 3 years or more before we'll get a final determination as to whether it will be a permitted use and this can go forward.
what if it fails? What's your options?
Yeah, so the question is, what if that if this process doesn't land with a landfill sited here? We'll have to look at other options. There are other landfills in the state, so we could potentially long haul materials up to the border of Oregon and Washington, where there are some very large landfills. It's an additional cost, so there's a cost to that. There are challenges, weather challenges to long haul materials through the winter. You become dependent on roadways and the conditions of the roadways, and in the short term, there are concerns around the amount of carbon to transport that amount of material. We could see the electrification of long haul equipment, but currently it's not. So those are some of the concerns. We've continued to look at those options, and are there other alternate technologies that might be available? The potential of rail haul. So we're actually continuing and consigned a study to look at those options as we're ready to prepare and present this to the county board, so they'll understand those options.
Looks like you're running out of time to me.
Yeah, it's getting tight. Yeah. And then the last piece I want to touch on is community engagement outreach goals. This is one of those exercises, and just trying to get the community involved and aware of what we're doing. We want it to be as transparent as possible. Nothing worse than a resident comes and says, "I just heard you're looking at a site near my house, and you didn't tell me about it." And we've heard that often, and we've tried to be as open and transparent as possible. Yet we haven't been able to communicate to everybody. So we're going to continue to try and communicate anywhere and everywhere that we can about this process. This is just kind of a wordle of some of the comments, a snapshot in time. This was when we had 12 sites in the mix. These were the types of comments that we were getting from folks, attributes of concern. We've gotten well over 1,000 emails from folks. We've had several hundred people attend the various SWAC meetings to provide their comments and areas of concern. We hope that continues, that we hope that we continue to hear from folks as to what are your questions, what are your concerns, what are your preferences? So.
What is if it's 250 acres to the actual pit, what do you project, how long will that last you?
Yeah, so the question is, how long would a 250 acre site last us? The design criteria that we're going by is we want a facility that will last for 100 years. And we're doing that based on current growth rates of the waste stream. So anticipating growth for the next 100 years in this community, as well as being conservative on what our recovery rates would be. You know, it's our hope that this will be the last landfill that is ever needed to be sited in Deschutes County, that down the road that we will find other means of diversion, and that we'll see other means of design of packaging, so that things are designed to be recycled, designed to be reused, designed to be recovered, that our waste stream over time diminishes, not increases. But 100 years is the timeline. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
A question about the recent BLM site and
Yep.
the timeline that catch up for these other sites. That might look like that's a longer process.
Yeah, so the question is, what's the timeline on some of the BLM sites and their potential on-ramping into this? So we had 3 potential BLM sites. The 90 site off of 97 was ruled out because of the airport. There was one on the Crook County, Deschutes County border off of Powell Butte Highway. That site was removed from further consideration after the last SWAC meeting. We got very significant public response to that site. But there's a significant technical issue with that site, and that is it's about 130 feet of rock all the way down, no soils in it. It's just pure rock. So if we were to try and operate on that site, the landfill ultimately would be well over 130 feet tall, which currently not landfill when we're completed is only going to be about 35 feet above this the original terrain. We prefer not to build a mountain. But the operational costs and operational issues trying to deal with a landfill without soil available, you basically have to grind rock into soil to use that for your daily needs. So that site was ruled out for those predominant reasons. There's one last site that's off of Highway 20 and the Horse Ridge Frontage Road, kind of right where that joins up. The SWAC is held on to that committee for that site for further consideration. That also has some challenges. That's all predominantly rock. There's different layers of rock. There might be some dirt in there that would need a bit more looking at to see if it would ultimately be viable. One of the reasons that was held for further consideration is that the Moon Pit site and the Ross site are both within what has been proposed as the city limits for the community of Mountain View. So I don't know if you've heard about that, but there's the petition that has come to the county for consideration of the incorporation of a new city here in the county. And that is around Milliken. Milliken is kind of the center of it, but it's about 225 square miles, maybe more than that. So both the Moon Pit and Roth East site would fall within the city limits. So that would require discussions with the new city as to whether they were willing to host a site. This third BLM site was thought to be outside of those city limits when the SWAC last met. However, that also is within the proposed city limits of Mountain View. So we'll have to see what happens with that Mountain View process and if it moves forward with the boundaries as submitted. So that's to be determined. So, yeah, another speed bump,
Yes.
right? Yeah.
Is on that speed bump for that particular side that are more legislative, and have you taken the steps to start that process?
So we don't want to take the legislative steps unless we know that there's some technical viability to it. So we are kind of going to have to make the decision over the next couple months as to whether we want to move that forward, or whether we have to let that one go. So that will be discussed at the next couple of SWAC meetings.
Is there any option for staying at the landfill site, or do you have any more land there? That you could dig another pit or something?
Yeah, the question is whether not landfill could be continued to be expanded or what have you. No, we have a 147 acre permit for that site. We have within our permit, we have a height restriction of 37 feet, 35 feet. I don't know the exact number. But we've designed the facility to that height. If we were to go above that, we'd start blocking views of the neighbors to the east. And we're starting to get more and more residential uses around it. We have a school around us. So we've kind of made the decision that that's really achieved its purpose, and it's time to close it.
Have you worked with the adjacent counties to see if there's any sites there?
Well, I would say one of the responses when we almost put a landfill on the border with Crook County was we got a number of calls from Crook County that they weren't terribly enthused about the idea. Crook County has considered in the past the potential of building a regional facility, but that's dried up. That's not going to happen. There is a potential private developer who we've heard about building a facility in Lake County, but we've not heard anything on that in over a year and a half. Again, that's a pretty long haul for our waste. So no, there's currently no discussions with other counties as to siting a fill. We aren't necessarily interested in siting a fill here in landfill in Deschutes County and importing waste from other counties either, just like they are probably with our waste. Yeah.
Two-part question. How much will this cost to build and run, and how is it paid for? Is the first part?
Yep.
Don't answer that.
Yeah. So the question is, how much would this take to build and operate, and how's that paid for? So just like the current landfill, it's paid for by the disposal fees. So this isn't tax-based. The solid waste department is an enterprise fund. So we have to, our fees for service, our disposal charges cover our cost to operate. The projection to develop the beginning part of the landfill is anywhere, I think we have currently a placeholder amount of $15 million. With a landfill, as I showed in that initial slide, you build a cell at a time. So we're investing every 3 to 5 years another $8 million to continue to expand it. So over the course of a landfill's life, it's going to be a $100 million investment, or well more than that.
Yes, part of
Yeah.
that. And how much does the county spend right now to reduce waste and increase diversity to expand the life of the site?
That's a good question. So I think there's a distinction between what the ratepayers pay. A lot of the recycling diversion is actually done through direct payments to their hauler. So your recycling costs are embedded in your collection fee. So at the county, our budget is maybe $500,000 currently. This year we budgeted close to $1 million in waste reduction staff and programming. That will increase over time. And we have a roughly $20 million budget. But your hauling fees anywhere from $5 to $10 a month is covering your costs for recycling and composting activities. All right,
Add on question. there.
part three.
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
If you were able to increase to 45%, which is the goal.
Yeah.
Have you done like calculations, how much that would save the county?
No, not at this point, but we will be doing that over the next few months. So we do want to start creating proposals to the Board of County Commissioners around what investments in new infrastructure, what the benefit of that would be in terms of diversion, also what would the impact on either disposal fees or rates. It's not necessarily cheaper to process a ton of recyclables than it is to process a ton of garbage. In fact, it's more expensive, but you're making a commodity. And it really depends on the value of those commodities. With the Recycling Modernization Act, they're going to actually be setting floor values for the different commodities, which will help. I believe it's intended to make it so that recovering a ton of materials is cheaper than wasting it. So.
If you move the site and this becomes just a transfer station.
Yep.
Not. Will we still be taking yard debris and that kind of thing out to not?
Yeah. Yeah, even if we set up a somebody's holding out. Let me respond to this. So yes, you'll still be taking yard debris and everything to whatever transfer station you're taking it, then we would take the action of getting that to the appropriate location where it would be composted. Yeah. So can people not hear me? Well, I'm gonna wrap it up anyway. How's that? So we're available for questions and comments. We have the whole team from the Solid Waste Department, Jeff Merwin, our Environmental Compliance and Infrastructure Manager, Todd Sween, our Operations Manager, Angie Hefner is here with our Solid Waste Department. So feel free to ask us or any of the folks from Parametrics any questions you have. So thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. What's your name?
Oh, I know.